2021 Corvette is the 2LT package convertible model. So not a Z51, not the performance model, which means has a little bit smaller brake package, has a little bit different suspension tuning, and is also the convertible model. But the overall design, the overall layout is just like every single Corvette for sale today, which is a mid-engined 6.2 liter V8 sports car with an 8-speed Tremec dual clutch transmission. And that is the layout that Corvettes are using today. We have moved away from what some people consider the truest expression of the Corvette, which is a front-engined rear drive car. We have eschewed that for a mid-engine rear drive car, and I, for one, am fine with that. First thing is, with a mid-engine car, and I'm an MR2 owner, so I know that one of the challenges with a mid-engine car is airflow management and cooling management. And Chevy has put a lot of work into making air go the proper places, making enough air go to the proper places, and keeping the proper things cool. And just paying a lot of attention to how the air flows around the car. Up front here, we can see two giant heat exchangers right in the airflow, right behind these grills. There's one here, there's one over on this side. So right away, you've got a lot of cooling capacity. Even though this is a radical departure in layout from previous Corvettes, you can still see a lot of previous generation Corvette styling cues, like the way the nose comes to a point, very C7-like. Even if you look at C5s and C6s, they were beginning to use a bit of this design language. A lot of the lines on the front of the car flow towards this very point here, which is of course right behind the Corvette crest, which looks a little bit like a deer now. The DNA is moving in a very definite direction. You can really see that in a lot of these styling details, like the way that all these lines on the front flow towards this point right here at the very front of the car. Also, this little integrated splitter here, it's even more aggressive on the Z51, very reminiscent of some of the C7 design language. And one of the interesting things about this car and just the way it sits, the splitter here is actually higher than the under tray in there. It's actually inviting air to go under the car. A lot of instances you don't want air to go under the car, but as we're going to show you in a second, Chevy is inviting air under this car because it's doing a great job of managing that air as it goes to the back. So let's get it up a little bit higher and we'll see what that air is doing as it travels to the back of the car. This is about as flat of a floor as you're ever going to see on a mass market production car. You might see a floor like this on a more limited production, a specialty built car, but for something that is mass market, built on an assembly line, a lot of care has been taken to really manage the airflow under here. Even down to little details like the way these under trays wrap around smoothly up into the suspension here and are notched for the suspension. We've got a couple of dropped areas here, trying to get a little bit of air into the area where the engine and transmission is. These are kind of hanging out in the airflow. In fact, you can see that there is an airflow deflector up inside there. We'll take this panel off in a second and take a closer look at that. So even as we come back here to the engine cradle, this big aluminum cradle holds the engine, the transmission, rear suspension. This is essentially the rear subframe back here. Nice aluminum fill panel over the entire thing, smooths that airflow out, and really nice cutouts here give you instant access to the oil filter. This panel has nice access to the transmission drain, and I love the way that these are just sort of cut and radiused around the open areas in the engine cradle. It gives it a nice finished appearance, but also manages a lot of the airflow going underneath this car. Now that we're all the way at the back of the car, we can see why Chevy was cool letting all that air under here, because we've got a nice upturn here at the back, get some diffuser action, lower the entire air pressure under the car, get a little bit of downforce, or at least remove some lift. So nice, thoughtful design all the way to the back here. And we can see that even the bumper does not hang out into the airstream the way so many modern cars do. You have this giant scoop on the bottom of the bumper. You can pay all the attention you want to the air coming under the car, and then you're just grabbing it with the inside of the back bumper. Chevy has thoughtfully positioned this bumper above all of the solid stuff back here. So clearly a intentional design element and also a functional design element to get that airflow clear of the bottom of the car. We're going to pull this lower engine cover off, get a little bit better look at what makes her go here. But while I'm down here, it's pretty interesting that there is hardly any steel in this car structurally at all. We've got a little magnetic flashlight here, and it just does not stick. It'll stick to a bolt, no problem, but it does not stick to any structure of the car whatsoever. There's the oil filter, obviously fasteners, but everything else on this car, even the frame where we are jacked up, is either aluminum or fiberglass. So once we have that panel off, we can actually see that Chevy has kind of taken the LS engine architecture. They've just sort of flipped everything upside down, and instead of the accessories being up top, the exhaust manifolds actually point upwards, and all the accessories have been now moved to the bottom. Does a couple of things. It makes packaging much easier, I would think, and it also lowers the center of gravity quite a bit. In fact, you can see we've got the coil packs mounted here in 2 banks, going to the spark plugs that are now mounted under that exhaust manifold. You actually have a really good view of how that exhaust manifold essentially is just mounted upside down from what we're accustomed to seeing, and is pointing straight up. You can also get a great view from down here of just how low this motor sits. This is the bottom of the main pulley, and this is the bottom of the engine right here. So of course this is a dry sump engine. This engine feeds the oil from a remote tank into the engine, and then recirculates it back into that remote tank, rather than having a low engine mounted sump. What that does is it allows them to get this engine much lower, which gets the center of gravity much lower, which provides for both great handling and, again, great packaging. So the way to make a car very, very short is to take as much vertical componentry out of the mix as possible, turn it into horizontal componentry, move it somewhere else, and that's what they've done with the dry sump installation on this C8 here. So next thing we're going to do is pull a couple of these wheels off and take a look at the suspension. Obviously Corvettes have always been known as being excellent handling cars. This car, as we found out on the track, is no different. So let's get the wheels off and see what makes the suspension work on this thing. Well, the first thing I noticed taking these wheels off is some nice bullet nose lug studs, which, as somebody who's going to, if I had a car like this, I'd be taking it to the track a lot and changing wheels, changing tires. That's much appreciated. It's something that I would really enjoy having. So anyone who's seen the undersides of a Corvette, from anything from C5 on up, really C4 on up to some extent, is going to find a lot of familiar things under here. Upper and lower control arms, sway bar, tie rod. The big difference that you notice right off the bat is this lower connection right here, and that is because the ball joint is flipped upside down on this car. The ball joint actually points down rather than pointing up. So what's that do for us? Well, it allows us to package a much taller knuckle into the same space as a shorter knuckle that had the ball joint connection underneath here, and it allows us to get the geometry of that upper and lower control arm much more specific while still having good articulation out of that knuckle. So really, really clever way to repackage that. Let's go up in the air a little bit higher, and we'll take a look at a few things sort of around under here. So now that we're around under the car, we can see a lot closer the arrangement of these upper and lower control arms. Upper control arm, the ball joint connects from the top, and the lower control arm, ball joint also connects from the top. That is a pretty cool arrangement there. The other thing we see, something that I am familiar with looking at all the time under a Corvette, but is a first on Corvettes in the modern era. That is coil-over shocks, coil spring on this car, rather than the traditional transverse leaf spring that we are accustomed to seeing on Corvettes. With a traditional coil-over spring and shock arrangement, you've got quite a bit of vertical component to that, so it naturally is going to lend itself to a taller hood line. They've kind of gotten around that by leaning the shock way over on this thing. When you look at it from the front, you can see how far that shock has leaned over to provide a little bit less vertical component. And one of the things that does is it actually, as that shock articulates, this angle is only going to increase. This point right here is going to move upward and also rotate around the inner point here. So this point here that the lower part of the shock is connected to is going to move up and out a little bit as this goes up. So the angle of this shock is going to change through its range of motion. So the amount of leverage that this shock produces is also going to change throughout its rate of motion. So the effective spring rate out here at the wheel changes through the rate of motion. So on a Corvette, that generally means that the spring is going to actually be less effective as the car moves. These sound like a lot of scary words, but as we found on our C5, if you tune it properly, it works absolutely fine. You have a little bit of a digressive spring rate, but tune those springs right to begin with, match it with a proper set of anti-roll bars, and you don't have to worry about anything. One other thing I noticed though is that this car feels very camber challenged in the front, especially in a stock condition, but Chevy has given us the means to fix that by the use of these eccentric bolts holding the lower control arms on, who should be very familiar to anybody who's worked on previous generation Corvettes. So you can move the lower mounting point of these control arms in or out to dial in as much or as little negative camber as you would like. I am hearing you can get up to about 2.7 to 3 degrees of negative camber in the front of these cars, and that should go a long way to curing some of the turn-in push that this car seems to have. Also, Chevy will give you specs for track alignment on this car. Here's the rub though. While it's very easy to adjust the camber simply by loosening these bolts and rotating those eccentrics, the fact that the center line of this control arm is behind your tie rod, as you increase negative camber, as you move this lower point out here to increase the negative camber, you're going to tow these wheels way in. So that's not something you can do on a Friday afternoon on your way to the track on a Saturday, because you're going to have to get a proper alignment to reset your toe after you change that camber. Now, is it possible that you could mark your tie rods and have toe settings that you could do yourself? Yeah, you could probably do that just fine, or take some specific measurements, but you're not going to get away with increasing camber without feeling some effects in the toe. So if you're looking to do a track alignment on these, just understand that it's going to be a sort of a multi-factor alignment. So the first thing we notice back here, especially if you spent time under a Corvette before, is one of the cool things about having the architecture that places the engine in the rear is you get more height in the rear. You get a taller back of the car, which lets you mount these rear shocks in a much more favorable angle and in much more favorable positions. On a C5, if you're familiar with the C5, the upper shock mount is almost vertically aligned with the upper control arm mounts. It's maybe just a little bit above those. And to get enough shock travel, just like the front on this car, it has to be seriously leaned in. Otherwise, the shocks just end up being ridiculously short and having very, very little travel. Well, because of the architecture of the car, because it has a much taller rear end, you get a much longer, much more vertical shock, and the lower mounting of the shock is actually up towards the top of the knuckle on this car. We have a much more sort of normal length shock absorber and normal angle shock absorber in the back of this car. Again, also a coilover, not a transverse leaf spring as in previous Corvettes. So different design philosophy there, but of course a much more modern design philosophy. And again, this is pretty familiar to Corvette people, seeing these upper control arms bolted to the rear of the chassis. We're going to get it up in the air a little bit further and look at how they connected the stuff underneath. But yeah, the first thing you notice here is, unlike some previous Corvettes, much more vertically oriented shock absorber, which is great to keep that shock and spring rate consistent throughout the range of motion. Makes for a much more predictable car, and one you don't have to tune around. This is really interesting mounting of the rear tie rod, doing it horizontally rather than vertically. And actually, the whole bottom part of the rear knuckle is interesting, because the ball joint is at the extreme forward side of the knuckle, and then the tie rod is at the extreme rear of the knuckle, almost turning the lower control arm and the tie rod into two lower links themselves. And if we look at where the hinge points are on these, they line up pretty darn well. So I think that is what is going on there, is they made an effort to make sure that the lower points where this knuckle hinged were on the same plane. Otherwise, what's going to happen, if you have a traditional mounting where you have, even if you have this ball joint in the center, then you're going to have the tie rod up here a little bit. As it articulates, because you have those two hinge points on different vertical planes, you're going to get another order of motion out of this this knuckle. So you're going to get like dynamic changes of the angle of that knuckle, in not just the one axis of it tilting up like this, but also toe changes, and maybe even like twisting or orientation changes. Minor, but anytime you can solve a problem, go ahead and solve it. And I think that's a lot of what's going on here. The fact that they've tried to put both of these hinge points on the exact same horizontal plane, and then they've put the fixed point for the inside of the tie rod directly above the hinge point for the rear control arm. So as these hinge this way, they're both describing the exact same arc out here, wind up that way. So yeah, you've got a much more controllable dynamic toe change. You're always going to have some dynamic toe change. Of course, we mentioned before that this is the convertible version of the Corvette C8. Now, one thing I love about the way this car is shaped is that you almost would not know this is the convertible version unless you saw it in action. It is a very well integrated, power tracting hardtop. It hides itself very well, but it also provides some really neat detail elements, like this contrasting color panel here, just to let you know that there is something special going on back there. And speaking of something special, it is an absolute treat to watch this thing in action. So part of the fun inside is the all-digital dash display, which gives you access to a lot of different performance functions, a lot of different gauges, and a lot of customization. Now, there are base dashes set up for the three modes. Right now we're in the touring mode, and we can switch over to sport mode here, and you may actually hear the exhaust get a little bit louder. You see that we have access to a little bit different shaped tach and engine temp and G-force gauges. Or we can go into track mode, where we get transmission temp, engine temp, oil temp, tire pressure at all four tires, and a multi-performance meter that we can scroll through, and even set a lap timer in our PDR if we were to either select a racetrack from their database or set up a custom racetrack that we want to use. Well, that is our look at the C8 Corvette. You know what? It's a different approach to the Corvette, but it is one that I really appreciate, because what Chevy has done here is they have taken the essence of the Corvette, which is a lot of performance for a reasonable price and world-class presence. And they have said, you know what, we don't care that some people on the internet may think that a front engine rear drive layout defines a Corvette. What defines a Corvette is what it does. It's like Batman. It's not who it is under the skin, it's what it does that defines it. And what this Corvette does is exists at a world-class level for $82,000 in this case, which is a heck of a lot less than cars that you would be cross-shopping this against. So I hope you liked our look at the Corvette. If you are enjoying our content, you can check us out on the web at grassrootsmotorsports.com. Do me a favor, if you're watching this video on YouTube, go right down here, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. We would appreciate it. Hit that bell and you will get first crack at all of the content that we post. Folks, we will see you in the shop next time. I'm JG Pasterjack. Thanks for watching all of our great stuff here at Grassroots Motorsports.
Support brands that support Grassroots Motorsports. Get your chemical solutions from CRC Industries. Visit crcindustries.com to learn more.